Everyone. I think, Leanne, we are good to go and we can start.
Yes, we can.
Fine. So good morning to you all. Welcome to this webinar, the R2C, which is part of the R2 series. And just a bit of a background to R2C and Victoria Ventures. So R2C is the Research to Commercialization program that with funding from the RISA Fund, the Kenya National Innovation Agency, in collaboration with Victoria Ventures, has been implementing for the past almost 2 years now in Kenya and in Ethiopia this far. So a little bit about Victoria Ventures is that Victoria Ventures is a consulting and fund management firm focuses on entrepreneurial finance across Africa. So we have been working on this program together with Kenya. And the main purpose of the program is that researchers across universities and research centers and academic institutions across the country to help them gain an understanding on how to commercialize their research. Then the other bit is that we have been also working with champions across institutions to capacities to support the commercialization of research across. And so far, we have worked with more than 100 champions in the institutions and worked with 38 innovators this far. And it has been such a beautiful learning opportunity. And part of what knowledge dissemination opportunities like this webinar itself. So we come together and discuss some things that could be of importance to innovators and the institutions to understand in relation to innovation commercialization. So we have these webinars each and every month, and this will be one of those. And today our moderator will be Dan Midega. Dan, you could introduce yourself and take over. But welcome to this session and feel free to interact and ask more questions. Thank you. Dan?
Yeah, thank you so much, Phyllis. It's a great introduction to the R2C program. Good morning, everyone. Morning here in Kenya. Could be afternoon where you are or evening, whichever will work. My name is Daniel Mideka. I have the pleasure of hosting this day's webinar with one of my good friends, Dr. Adomdza, who will introduce himself after this. As Phyllis has said, part of why we have this is just knowledge dissemination for R2C programs. And the title for this webinar is How to Leverage Public and Private Funding for R2C Programs. And I thought it would have been a perfect stage for, our speaker to mentor, especially the Kenyan ecosystem. And looking forward to engaging with you. For this program, I am the male expert, but I'm a learning expert. For this program, I'm a male expert, but I also run an innovation on the site called the Private Drive as a founding partner. So feel welcome, feel free to engage, and looking forward to how this goes. Dr. Gordon?
Thank you, Dan. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. I was telling Dan earlier that today in Ghana is the start of our Ghana Digital Innovation Week. So I had to leave home early to be at the event and be able to do the webinar before the event starts. So my internet I'm on cellular internet, not a regular strong Wi-Fi. So I'm going to say hi on the screen and then turn off the camera if you don't mind. Thank you, Dan, for the introduction. So I'm Gordon Adomdza. I'm an associate professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at Ashesi University, a small liberal arts themed college in Ghana, but also quite steeped in the ecosystem. I guess the one thing that I can point to that I could say gives me any sort of platform to talk about R2C is that I led the development of the National Framework for Research and Innovation Commercialization for Ghana. So I have some perspectives there that I can share. So I'm very excited to be here to have this conversation with you. Dan said, mentor the Kenyan ecosystem. That's a very, you know, you're putting a lot of pressure on me, but of course I can share from my experience.
Yeah, it shouldn't be a lot of pressure because we met when you were mentoring the Neil group. So, and for everyone, Neil is
You're
so I think
cornering me there.
that must have been bigger pressure. So this is
Sure.
more of mentorship, and I'm sure you're going to do a really good job at it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So maybe I can give apologies. We were supposed to be joined by another good friend of mine, Dr. Tesser Nyulaku of Adam Smith International, but he's been traveling in Berlin and had a bit of a clash with these timings. Requested if he can maybe join later or do another recap webinar at a later time. So maybe we can discuss that with the Victoria team and then see how it goes. So thank you, Dr. Gordon, for the great introduction. As I said, Dr. Gordon was also really instrumental in mentoring the Kenya network of entrepreneurial institution leaders in Kenya. And yeah, I know that it's going to be really good speaking about public and private funding for R2C programs. So we wanted to discuss three things basically today. One is how do you blend public and private funding to create synergies for R2C programs. And here we wanted to just discuss with Dr. Gordon or hear from Dr. Gordon some of the roles that public and private sector plays in funding research activities or research initiatives. And then number two is how do you unlock especially catalytic private sector investment for the space. And then number three is how do you navigate public funding and policy support for these programs. So we don't necessarily have to follow that format because it's supposed to be like a fireside chat. So I'm guessing it's going to be generic and the conversation will grow as we talk. And yeah, so I guess the first question I could ask you, Dr. Gordon, is funding. From your perspective, what comes to your mind when you hear public funding or private funding? I know most people, when they hear public funding, they think just government funding, mostly local government funding. But from you as someone who's who works in an entrepreneurial institution, what comes to your mind when you hear public versus private funding? Maybe you can start there.
Right. Thank you, Dan. So that's a very good point. Most people think it's local government funding. In fact, when we started the work on trying to understand the commercialization process in Ghana, one of the things that struck us was that a lot of work and projects that are done at the ministries, take it whichever ministry. We were working with the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Environment, Science and Technology. But when we looked into it, the Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Communications and Digitalization, and a number of other ministries were dealing with research and innovation. They had agencies, they have agencies that are focused on research. And so from that perspective, then you can think of them as research institutions that are different from the universities, the public universities. So the government funds the public universities and then also funds these agencies that are that are agencies of these ministries that conduct research. Now, that's one thing that was quite interesting was that a lot of the funding for projects in these agencies came from development partners. I don't know how it is in Kenya. I know Kenya has a very interesting sort of governance structure. It's like a federation, but it's not. It's quite unique. But in Ghana, what we learned is that a development partner has to align with a ministry because it's intergovernmental. So GIZ and FCDO, they have to have. It's almost like they have to be adopted by a ministry, which then through which they would conduct programs and do funding and all of that. So what it means then is that when we say government funding, it's a lot of it is coming from development partners, right? Because there wasn't a clear distinction between government money and development money, development partner money, because the money from development partners were channeled through the government. So that gave it that gave it a different twist, because then then the question is, well, who's setting the research agenda? Who is coordinating among the different development partners to make sure that the research is aligned with national development? Who is evaluating and following up on research output to make sure that it actually goes from R to C? So all of those questions came up. So I guess I'm saying that I think the space for funding has changed quite a bit. And at least when we say public, I think it's a bit more complicated than just your local government funding some research.
Yeah. Do you find okay, because I usually think development partners are government, right? Because it's government to government. So is it easier in Ghana, the kind of structure for development funding injecting into public or government funding for research? Is it an easier pathway compared to private funding, especially considering that R2C can be a bit complicated,
Yeah, it's interesting because, in fact, when you say private funding, then I start, I frown. I'm thinking, what is that? Because it's almost non-existent, right? It doesn't, even if at least from the work we did, if you're able to track private funding, it doesn't come the way you think it should come, right? It's mostly in R&D projects that are highly policed by the private partner because they tie it to very specific market outcomes. So an example would be that a large, a producer of, let's say, an FMCG producer. For example, there's this company, YAAZ, I think, that makes all kinds of, for lack of a better word, flavors of sanitary pads, right? So mint and, so many different chamomile and so many different, struggling to find the word for it, but types, let's say, or, the variations of sanitary pads, and they produce in China, but they do the R&D here in Ghana. And so trying to understand, how much mint or how much mint to add to another sort of ingredient for sanitary pad, is all of that requires some local research. So they will work with maybe a university lab or one of these labs at our Council for Scientific and Industrial research, and it'll be a very specific project, right? And so there are many examples of that. In fact, I don't actually hear of private organizations putting big amounts of money forward with some parts restricted, some parts unrestricted for a research organization to conduct research with, the same way you would get with a grant from a development partner. I've actually never heard of that before. Maybe there exists, but it's quite unusual, in our part of the world.
Do you consider something like philanthropic funding, private funding? Because that's a bit different. I know, especially for early stage projects or products in development.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So I think you're right. So philanthropic funding would then be that's definitely private, because then that there are it's not tied to, like in Ghana, practically will not be tied to a ministry. They would decide, and they'll probably work with an NGO, and so then they call the shots and decide which NGO. And in fact, there might be some parts of it will be unrestricted, just like a government fund or a grant will be. Not to say that grants are unrestricted. I'm just saying, giving you room more than what a pure market private funder would do. Yes, but except that there are not many of those, right? A lot of the philanthropic funding will still be from abroad. Let's say a Bill and Melinda Gates funding, which may not be tied to a particular government, ministry. There are not many of such types of funding as I, that I encountered here.
Okay. And in your, because now this I'm going to, because I know you travel a lot and you speak in a lot of sessions. One of the things that came up when we went for the SEAL Summit recently was, innovators and research institutions should think of R2C in terms of the impact. So, most funders would fund impact, as opposed to funding profit. Because if you can make a broader impact, then it will trickle down to profit. And with that in mind, with thinking about, like the broader impact of what R2C programs would have, or what products that come out of the R2C research commercialization journey would be, what would you say is, according to you or according to your experience, and like you've traveled to many places and talked and spoken in many universities and conferences, you've learned a lot. What would you say is the secret to blending public and private funding? Should there be a blend, or should we maybe for early stage projects think about like a different funding model, as opposed to like a scaling project? Think about a different funding model. Like what would you say would be the secret? Should we blend? Should we do? What should we think about? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so blends are always very interesting if it's possible. So I think what I've seen is that, traditionally private funding is normally funding profit if it's from the market, or funding impact at a basic level if it's from philanthropy, and then also public funding would normally focus on impact, even though now we're seeing some very interesting models, because like I said, public funding coming from development agencies sometimes look at, building regional markets for resilience, right? So a lot of that is private impact, if you will, not public impact per se. So I'll give you a quick example. A lot of the EU funding that I have seen go towards ensuring resilience in our communities, and I think there was one project that we worked on where they actually identified 2 regions in Ghana to build resilience programs for entrepreneurs, and they didn't say it like this, but it sounded like these were the 2 regions where a lot of the immigrants from Ghana were coming from. And so as a way of controlling irregular migration to Europe, then it looked like this is not written in any of the RFPs. It looked like a lot of the programs, because part of it was supporting returnee migrants in these regions to develop entrepreneurial businesses, and some of it was scaling people in these regions to develop businesses, so that there will be more, the communities will be more resilient, right? None of that is social per se. Most of that is looking at the markets. It's profit oriented. Although the profit doesn't come to the funder, so that's a bit. It's not your regular model, right? It's not your regular model. It's like public funding for private gain, sort of,
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Did we lose you, or? Did we lose you?
And programs will look at sustainability way down to trying to sorry, you can still hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, let me can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Okay. Is it better now? Okay, so I just switched networks. My apologies. Let's try this and see if it works. You can hear me okay, right? Stable?
Yeah.
Okay. I think there's a bit of a lag, but we'll try it. Otherwise, I'll switch back. I'll switch back to the other one when it works. So Dan, I was saying that traditionally, what I've seen is that private fund goes to shall sometimes develop a new area for additional funding. So that would be the funding type that you about. So nurse, if I were to put it, the types of entrepreneurs that see, they can see that if they funding in an area, follow on public funding will expand the area, then give up for private. Because if that space expand the electric vehicle space, then they can come in. So we'll start that these kinds of greenfield private funding, which is supposed to be catalytic in
Dan, I think maybe Dr. Gordon could switch back to the other network. This one
yeah,
is.
can you hear me? I've switched back, but I see that it's not very strong. Can you hear me?
Yes, at least we can hear you better.
Okay.
Maybe from the top.
It's interesting because It's interesting because the network that is not working well is MTN, which is the largest telco, and the one that seems to be working is Vodafone, which is much smaller. So, yeah. Dan, you can hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can continue, please.
So sorry. Ooh.
Sorry about the internet. The conversation is really nice, so you can just continue.
Recording in progress. It seems like it's back. It seems like it's back now, Dan.
Do
Oh
we?
dear.
Yeah.
Recording in progress.
Okay.
Dan, I can see you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. All right. I see that the network strength dropped from 3G to maybe 2G or something. So I was just saying that I think the interesting blend that we're seeing now is when private funders are coming in as catalytic funders. And sometimes they design it. I think you need to be a bit more sophisticated in those kinds of funding where you see an area that is green, it's a green field, and you think that you're going to, it's not a developed market, but you think that the prospects are high. So you put money in, let's say EV, electric vehicles. So as a private funder, you put money into sort of, it's almost like business development, right? You build the space, you conduct some research, you identify stakeholders, you connect them, you identify impact projects, and then now you help development agencies write RFPs that then bring in public funding to further expand the space. Because if the space is expanded, you can come back and introduce business models that enable you to reap the benefits. Right? So more people are coming in, and sometimes they even, engage with public funders, and they know that if they put in this amount of private funding and they think of it as long-term catalytic, then public funding will follow, and then private investment will follow. Regular private investment will follow. So we're seeing that. I think the space has become more complicated, because people are realizing that there are many ways of doing the funding. But one thing that I think underlies all of that is people being public and private, government partners who are saying, "Come, let's co-create the funding structure," right? Because what they've been doing has not been working. The implementation partners have not been forthcoming. So they figured out that co-creating some of these impact programs, whether for profit output or for pure impact, is becoming more successful.
Yeah.
So I think there's more complexity, but then funders have realized that if they can come together, they can sort of develop ways of tackling the complexity.
Yeah. So this just brings me to the second point of discussion. I know there's the different models that you're talking about and how private and public or development partners are coming together to build these catalytic funds. But then at some point when you speak to like researchers or institutions that are trying to tap into these funds, they'll talk about bottlenecks. So how do we unlock this catalytic funding for all the players? Like, could you maybe take us through from your experience what or how innovators or institutions can make themselves more attractive to these funders or funding opportunities?
Right. So I'll tell you what I've seen here. There's an organization called IIGH, Impact Investing Ghana, which is part of the broader impact investing movement. And my good friend Amalate, who was also in Kenya for the Kenya summit, leads this organization. And in fact, what they've done is they put together the heads of the pension funds in Ghana, and they said, well, you guys need to diversify, and they said, oh, we don't do that. We don't invest in entrepreneurship. We only invest in the markets. And they said, well, let's have a series of seminars where we present to you what pension funds are doing in other parts of the world, right? And so they did that. They did a couple of presentations, and they started coming around. So a couple of the funds then started opening up. They know very well that they need to diversify. They know that nobody has pushed them to do it before. And so IIGH then sort of started a conversation with them. They came together. This is within probably about 2 years. They were able to put together, I think, I may get the numbers wrong, but something like an $85 million fund or something like that, right? So the point here is that, again, co-creation, it comes down to entrepreneurship and funders with entrepreneurial mindset, who are saying, okay, the electric vehicle space is going to explode. The infrastructure is not there. The funding mechanisms is not there. The nature of electric vehicles is that you can even sell them on a subscription basis. You can probably even sell access to the vehicle and not ownership, right? There's so many models you can do. But then, because the market is such that, because the market is not developed, someone needs to identify the key stakeholders. Number one, do stakeholder mapping to say, all right, these guys, the regulator, the import association, the automotive supply association or whatever, those who are going to be supplying the parts and so forth, that other organization, so they need to come together to orchestrate sort of an EV market and just have them come together frequently, whether it's breakfast meetings, Friday soirees, whatever it is that will move the conversation. By, let's say, a public funder, in this case, we said development partners can play this role, right? A development partner in a vehicle producing country who's interested in supporting this initiative, because of course development partners want to support projects that then link back to their economies, right? So they have an interest in maybe supplying parts, doing standards or whatever. And then down the line, you launch an RFP, and that RFP might be for this request for proposals for those who might not be familiar. Request for proposals for maybe a research project in the area, because a lot of these times you need to, for a lot of these kinds of projects, you need a scoping sort of review. You need to conduct research to establish the state of the particular sector, right? Those kinds of state of something research projects, which then does a really good job in mapping the space and the stakeholders and the effects and all of that. So you launch that RFP. The key players contribute to the research, and because they contribute to the research, now they are hooked, they are engaged, they want to do more, right? Because they are cited in the research, their work is cited, the opportunities are cited, and then through that, maybe another funder launches another RFP, another one, and before you know it, there are small projects in the space that are getting the attention of the stakeholders. And then, a larger public fund will follow, a private fund will start looking at building or supporting or coming on board to do infrastructure, and the space starts to grow. But what I've seen is that it always comes to leadership and entrepreneurship. When you leave it to the public funders, the ministries, the government ministries, they do what government ministries do, right? They will sort of write a big report and point to all the policies in the space, and then they'll go around and call something stakeholder engagement and come and collect their per diems and come and sit down, and nothing happens after that. Unless there's somebody else who's orchestrating beyond the public engagement. At least that's what I've seen.
That's a really good point. And I think we can discuss one last thing before we open it up for question and answer. And this is more to, like mentoring the innovators. Like I said at the beginning, like what advice would you have for, especially the innovators, like the Kenyan innovators for this program are mostly, university lecturers, professors, doctors, people doing their PhDs with products that they want to put through the R2C journey. And most of this is government funded. So basically government programs or government grants or university grants. So how can they use that to spark private sector interest? It will be very interesting to see, like from an entrepreneurial perspective, like in HSC, how do you, get innovators sparking private sector interest with their products as they navigate through the research to commercialization journey?
Right. That's a really good question. What we found here is that innovators come up with innovations, they approach industry, and industry says we want proof of concept. But industry doesn't want to fund proof of concept because there are no returns to prototypes, right? And innovators will normally go back to the universities and the research not to develop a proof of concept. So innovators normally get stuck in that middle portion. And I think that's typically where you need free money, right? Because at least from my perspective, from the work that we did with the national framework, we're not injecting free money into prototype development so that innovators are going to industry with working prototypes, tested prototypes. That engagement with industry is not going to go anywhere, right? Because industry is not going to fund your prototype when they don't see where it's going to go. They don't see the returns. So it's a difficult space. So what I would say is that researchers should, whilst looking for industry engagement, should probably also start looking for phase 2 public or grant funding to develop their working prototypes or to run pilots, because it's only when their prototypes are well tested that private industry will engage, you know. And so it don't don't take your research results and say this is so useful to industry and they have to adopt it and go around and do pitching. Try and figure out how to develop it further into, prototypes that work. It's a double-edged sword. It's like a chicken and egg. It's tough. But I think the answer is, thinking of prototype development as more research, and pitching it like that to your grant funders. And I'm saying this because I know most grant funders don't go as far as funding working prototypes, So yes, look for those industry connections, do your demos and all of that. But whilst doing that, have a strategy for, let's call it phase 2 grant funding for prototype testing.
Yeah. Nice. That's an interesting, it's a very interesting, eye-opening way, like way of thinking. I guess the last thing I wanted you to talk about was policy. Is there anything you could talk about in terms of policy and that how that then affects funding for research innovation? Like what government level policy and how that then affects funding, and how can we like maybe change the narrative? How does it work in Ghana, policy versus funding, and how can we maybe contextualize it here to help our innovators raise funds to develop their prototypes further, as you say?
Right. That's a really good question, because when you think of policy, you're thinking of how the government enables innovation, but also how they restrict innovation, right? By putting in all these standards and requirements and certificates and so forth. And unfortunately, we've seen more restrictions than we've seen enablers. And when the policy enables innovation, very few people know about it. It's not it's not common knowledge. So I think that, and when I say that, it's also true that if there are all these regulations and bylaws and whatever, and you don't abide by them, funders will not engage with you because they are always worried about getting stuck or getting shut down, putting in money and getting stuck because you didn't do some certifications. So I think it's extremely important to understand, conduct more research on the sector and the policies involved in terms of how the tax breaks or different agencies or ministries that you can probably even test your product with, right? Sometimes you can go to a government lab to test, to develop tests and so forth, and it won't cost you anything because they're actually open to supporting innovators, but you just didn't know about it. So exploring those opportunities, but also being very careful about the restrictions in terms of the certifications, the registrations, and if possible, when you look for funding, include these certifications and registrations, the costs in the ask, because those things can be quite expensive. And so if you have, during your engagements with whether it's a grant funder or an industry partner, make sure that you are including the certifications and all of that, because what it shows two things. One, that you understand the space and you understand what needs to be done, and you're being responsible in trying to get all your certifications. And the other thing it does is that it helps you pass on the costs to your sponsors and your helpers. So that you can be freed up to sort of put resources into other things that are equally important. So and then the last thing I'll say is that don't underrate the extent to which your reaction to regulations will affect your credibility. Because yes, people want innovators who are, if you will, breaking the rules and developing new ideas and solutions, but not innovators who are breaking the law. So, you have to make that distinction. You might say, I'm a non-conformist, because that's how I innovate. Yeah. But don't bring it to the law, because it affects your relationships, and it prevents people from helping you, because they are worried about somebody coming and stopping the whole show. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. It's just something that's crossed my mind. I was just thinking about like passing the cost of some of these things to your funder, and I don't know if maybe that could be a question from the audience. I hope we have innovators here. Do you find that sometimes when you're advising innovators or you're advising researchers to go for some type of funding, especially philanthropic funding, that sometimes philanthropists of development funders would fund you and expect your product or your whatever you're innovating to be open source? Like, how do you address that fear? A lot of innovators would have that fear, and that's the last question I'm asking you before we go to question and answer, and invite the attendees to start typing in the answers to the ones who want to type, but we'll open it up for everyone. Yeah, so that's the last question I'm asking, Dr. God.
Sure. So thank you for that. That's always a difficult situation. I think something else you said that made me think about the things that funders normally will say that they don't fund. Sometimes they'll say they don't fund your operations or whatever, and everything has to be project based, so they won't fund your let's say your basic setup, right? They won't fund your HR or your marketing, but they will fund the project officer or whatever. And so what we found is that then hire project-based staff, right? So that they'll fund, so if they say they only fund projects, well, put as much in the projects as possible, so that you'll be able to cover those costs. So if your project is big and you need an HR person to write the contracts and all of that, well, put your HR person as part of the project, right? So that is not a standalone cost that comes to your bottom line. So that's one thing. And then the other thing about open source, yes, a lot of funders will say, well, we want social impact, and therefore this has to be open source. The interesting thing about open source is that if you develop new technology and you don't protect it, what sometimes happens is that somebody can take that technology, protect it, and prevent the free. So it's really always think of putting technology out there for free without any kinds of protections. The best way to put technology out there for free is for the developer to own it so they can put it out there for free. Right? Because if they don't, somebody else will take it and lock it up. And I think this is an argument that can be made with funders to say, listen, we can put this out there for free because we want to have impact. Well, guess what? In a year or two, somebody can take it and lock it up. So what should we do? We should rather protect it and then put it out there for free. But when you protect it, then you can sometimes sort of design the way it's accessed publicly, right? I mean, there's so many models there. Sometimes you put it out there for free, but it has very technical elements to it. If it's like a new water drilling, borehole drilling system, or a new, let's say, a biodigester system or something like that. Yeah, you can put the knowledge out there for free. Stall, they will come and contract you to do it for them, to do the technical bit for them. And sometimes the funders just don't know these things, right? So you need to be able to come to them and say, yes, we can make it open source, no problem. But we need to put certain basic protections in to make the open source successful. You know, so I don't take it as, yeah, I'm not interested. The only return is in the development. There are ways of house living. I hope you could hear me, or did it break?
Oh, now I can hear you.
Break?
Oh, you're breaking again, Dr. Gordon.
I'm so sorry. Let's just wait for a second. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, now I can. Hopefully it can hold.
No, I was just saying that. Dan, let me know if you can hear me.
Yeah, maybe if you speak, because when you say, let me know if you can hear me, that's an interesting thing about technology. It always agrees to work. But when we start speaking, it disappears. But I think we can.
No, so
Yeah.
yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, so I was just saying that I was just saying innovators should not throw the quests for open, because there are so many ways in which they can negotiate protections for the innovations so that they can more effectively support open source policies. Because if they don't, open source policies can fall apart if someone else protects their innovation.
And thank you so much for that. I think
something that happened.
Sorry, I'm losing you again. I was just saying I'm really grateful for this session. I want to open this up for Q&A. We wind up because we are really spent on time. And the first question I'm reading from the chat is from Agnes Suma from RISA, from the RISA Fund. And she says, what I gather, Dr. Gordon, is that we still don't have deliberate efforts towards unlocking funding from private sector. Are there any funding models that incorporate private sector contributions? Is there any country in Africa that has been able to do this? I think you might have alluded to this, so maybe you can just,
Yeah. So I think the question came much earlier, before we started talking about catalytic funding. I saw the question posted. So I think the answer is catalytic funding, and I think that I don't have a good case study of countries that have done this, but I think that's the new thing. It's a new thing of co-creating funding models that didn't used to exist, and taking a long-term view to the co-creation is what we're seeing here. Yeah. So hopefully that answers the question. But it's a good thing to build up case studies of different countries that have figured this out.
so to Agnes, there's a catalytic fund that just ended in Kenya. It was run by the Synapis Group, but also funded by FCDO. I can't remember how it was called. But yeah, I think there's one catalytic fund that's run by Synapis, funded by FCDO, that tried to incorporate private sector contributions to public sector funding. I guess I can share it with the Victoria team, and they can distribute it to the audience. But that could be one example that we can leverage, though they were not necessarily funding research. They were funding SMEs and other private sector players. Yeah. Is there any other question from the audience? Now it's open. Phyllis, a little help?
Hi, Dan. Yes, I'm following through. But I can't see something else on the Q&A bit. So I guess maybe we can just choose to wrap it up.
Awesome. So if there's no other question in the Q&A, I'm hoping that this session was eye-opening to all our participants. It was for me at least, and I think for the points that I got was we need an entrepreneurial mindset among funders. So engaging with funders who possess entrepreneurial mindsets, focusing on innovation, scalability, and sustainable business models, because these are more likely to support high potential R2C initiatives. Number two is blending funding models, especially those that are catalytic, and also using co-creation mechanisms to do this. Number three is, at least from my perspective, I thought I got bridging the language of profit and impact. So facilitating conversations that have a balance between the objectives of profit for people who want to fund for profit and people who want to fund for impact. Stakeholder mapping for the R2C journey, I think that came out a lot. And then leadership and entrepreneurship beyond the public sector bureaucracy. So, like you're saying, while government ministries play critical roles, in holding funding for research, we have to develop this leadership and entrepreneurial thinking to drive R2C beyond the normal government working or the normal constraints of public sector bureaucracy. And then, engaging the private sector to prepare for phase 2 funding. I think that also came up. So, researchers should think about how to engage private sector investment so that they can secure follow-up funding for developing their projects further. That way, they can scale their innovations or their solutions easily because they can demonstrate that those solutions already work. And then finally, regulatory compliance and credibility, where we are saying we should never underestimate how our response to regulators affects our credibility. So, we have to adhere to and navigate through regulations effectively in order to build trust with funders and with stakeholders. And I think the last thing was, innovators should not really hold themselves back from the conversation of open source, the open source funding or open source condition for funding, because there's a lot of ways that innovators can still protect their innovations while attracting funding. So I guess that's the gist of it, Dr. Gordon. If there's something that I have missed out, maybe you can mention it, but I think that's the gist of the conversation today. And I really thank you for your time. I know it was really early in Ghana, but you made time for this. And personally, I'm really grateful. It's been an interesting journey, getting to know you in Mombasa, engaging offline, and then now having this session with you.
Thank you so much, Dan. It was very good. I think you did a really good summary. I don't know if it's possible to get that summary. I thought it was really well captured.
Yeah,
okay.
I can share that. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Back to you, Phyllis.
Thank you so much, Dan, and everyone for joining us. So we are going to upload this video on YouTube for everybody else to have an opportunity to have a second go at it and listen. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out through our official email, info@victoria.co.ke, or just also drop in my email in the chat. But thank you so much for joining us, and have a lovely rest of the day. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.